Saturday afternoon dime to go to the movies. And for refreshments, we were able to pull a banana from their banana tree and take that to the movie with us. And I was able to treat my friends who came to the movie. I was able to give them most of my banana because I really didn't like bananas. Bananas used to give me a bellyache, a real old-fashioned bellyache. And I didn't want to sit in the movies with a bellyache because of the banana. However, we're going to forget about the banana because today I'm living in California with a beautiful niece who is very much concerned with what she gives us to eat. Tonight's dinner was so very delicious.
Who is this niece?
The big treat was half a squash.
Okay, Mom, who was the niece you were talking about?
Pardon me?
You said that it was a niece. Who was the niece that you were talking about? You moved to California with your niece, you said.
Oh, my niece, yes. Who was my niece?
Who's your niece?
Her name is Joan.
Okay, could it be that it's your daughter?
And as a matter of fact, she prefers me to tell people that she is my daughter.
I am your daughter.
And she is my daughter. And that makes me very happy, knowing that I have a daughter. A daughter who is such a marvelous cook that she can make a delicacy out of half a squash.
Okay, so let me ask you something. We'll go back to your childhood, but let me ask you, I understand that you have two daughters. Who's your other daughter?
Well, we were very poor family. Really?
Okay, but who? Before you tell me about your family,
Yes.
You mentioned something that I'm trying to tell you that I'm your daughter.
Well,
I am your daughter, but you have another daughter too, and what is her name?
I have a daughter, Sue,
Right.
and she was a very fine student at Columbia. She went through Columbia having received her degree as a psychologist. She earns a very fine living because of her practice, which is an excellent one. She has children that come to her for help, and she's able to help them, or else her parents would not bring their child or children back. Now she has regained but she's gained a lot of respect in the community. She's worked down at NYU, and she has a private office on 72nd Street in a lovely apartment. I was there and saw her office. It was very thrilling to know that she could establish a routine such as she has, which occupies a good deal of her time in the college. She has a practice in Columbia. She has a practice in the Berkshire Mountains, where she has an office in her home. And apparently she's very highly regarded because she has enough children to support her. And I'm very proud of her. So what more can I tell you?
Okay, now we can go back. Now that you just said all about Sue, now we can go back to your childhood. Tell us
Okay.
that your family came from Russia.
That's right.
And your father's name?
My father's name was Max Kapitanovsky.
Okay, and your mom?
I do not know that he had any other siblings because he used to receive mail from the Soviet Union, and I once asked him, why don't you return some mail to these people? I'm sure that your brothers or sisters, whoever they are in Russia, would love to hear from you. And his response was not satisfactory because he said that I don't have any money to send them, and that's what they want. They want money, and I can't afford to send them any money. I am now supporting 7 very bright children who are good citizens in the United States, and I have to be sure that their education is well received by them. And we as parents, my wife, Devoda, my mother's name was Dora, but we called her Dvoda. Dvoda was the name she had when she came from Russia. And she was a very beautiful woman. Interesting thing happened. When she came here, my brother Murray, who was the youngest of our children, 7 children, he was my baby brother, as we call him. We lived on a street in Brooklyn, New York, called Lewis Avenue. Across from the building we lived in were 2 garages. The doors of those garages were locked, and we adored this little baby brother. We dressed him up like a real little pet and put him in front of those 2 garage doors and borrowed a camera so that we could take a photograph of him. That little boy was so bright and cute. He grew up to become a very successful social psychologist. He lived in California, in Los Angeles. The reason he wound up there was because when he was in the service during the Second World War, he was stationed in Nome, Alaska. It was very cold up in Nome, Alaska, and he wanted desperately to find a place where he could be stationed, where the climate and the weather would be more conducive to being enjoyable. So he did get have an opportunity at the time to go from Nome to Los Angeles. The woman he married was in special service there as an SRO, I don't know what you would call them, but she had a very special position there, and she was interested in helping people. And when Murray came down from Nome, Alaska, came to California, in Los Angeles, that's where he came. And he was walking along Beverly Boulevard in Los Angeles. He stopped in front of a camera shop, and he saw Laurie there again. Well, Laurie was the young lady who had volunteered to offer the servicemen who came from the Army, to offer them solace, to offer them hot drinks, and he hung around there. And when it was time for Laurie to leave, he asked if he could go home with her. And she accepted, so he came to her home, and she offered him some hot drinks and some food. And he was absolutely thrilled. Here was a wonderful young lady who was doing volunteer work to servicemen, and here I am, no longer a serviceman. I'm home from the Army, and she was offering me very good food. And I was thrilled with that, because I had no money to take her out to dinner. That would not have been possible for me, because whatever I earned, part of that money had to go home to my family to help support them. And for my father, it was a struggle, because he had a very small shop, a fruit and vegetable shop, and he had a fish tank in which he had fish, and it was approaching the season of Passover, and the women in the neighborhood would come in because they had to make gefilte fish, and they wanted to make sure he had good fish in that fish tank. So they used to put their hands right into the fish tank, grab hold of a carp or whatever he had in there, and they would do something that I thought was interesting. They would pick up the lobe around the ear of the fish, and they would smell it. And I asked my mother, what are they doing that for? Why are they smelling it? She said they do that and they smell it to be sure that it was fresh. And if the fish had an odor that was not too pleasant, then the person who came to buy it would insist that this was not fresh fish. And we were very concerned that they would get the freshest produce and the freshest fish. So that was the way my father started to support his family. And I immediately got hold of my mother once, and I said, I'm going to get a job. And she said, you're too young to get a job. I said, well, my older sister Jessie has working papers, and I'm going to use her working papers, and you come with me to the first office of Dr. Smith, and you tell him I want a job, and I have working papers to show that I'm old enough to work. Dr. Smith became a very important member of our family. He saved me from a very serious infection. See, my brother Murray, that little baby brother of ours, used to become a nuisance pest with me. What do baby brothers do? Well, how do they know they're being nuisance pests? He didn't know he was a pest. He was a little brother. And what happened one day, we always had a cat in the house. It seems that I had been chasing after my brother at one point when he was a little bit of a nuisance, whatever it was. I chased him, and I accidentally stepped on the toes of our gray kitten. It was not a kitten anymore, it was a big cat. I stepped on the toe, and the cat jumped and screamed, "Ah!" And then, after that, I was scratched by the cat, scratched on the cheek of my leg. And I developed a very severe infection. The reason it was so terrible and why did I step on the toes of the cat was because my brother Murray, that darling little baby brother Murray, who had become a nuisance, picked up my shoes and threw them out the window. We lived in a tenement house, and I knew that the shoes would be landing in the back of the tenement, and the lady who lived in the opposite building would always scream down, "Get out of here, you kids! Get out of here, you make too much noise!" And then at one point, she got so angry, she took a pail of water and poured it out the window. So the water landed on the cat. The cat does not like that. And the cat started running around like a little wild animal. It was only a cat, that's all, not a wild animal, a pet cat. And that cat jumped on my leg, the calf of my leg, and took a bite. And I let out a scream, and my mother took a look at my leg, and she said, "Oh my God, she's got an infection." And she said, "You come with me, we have to go to Dr. Smith." I did. I went with her to Dr. Smith, and he took a look at my calf, the calf of my leg, and he said, "She has an infection, and I have to do something, and I want you to call all the women in your building to bring press clean sheets, because I'm going to have to perform a little bit of surgery on this little girl's leg." Well, I didn't know exactly what he was talking about, and I didn't know exactly what he was going to do. But my mother ran to the neighbors and asked them for clean sheets, that the doctor had to perform an operation. So the neighbors came to the doctor's office. This is the famous Dr. Smith. And he put me down on a table, and he put a towel across my eyes, and he told the ladies who brought in clean sheets to hold my hands. And he said, "I have to cut something here. And she might scream and she might kick, but you have to hold her hands One lady will hold the hands and the other lady has to hold her feet so she doesn't let loose and scream and kick. And that was an experience I'd be very happy not to have to deal with again. But Dr. Smith had to perform the surgery and clean out the wound that was inflicted by that cat. And anyhow, I survived that surgery, and the women who brought the sheets were duly thanked by my mother. And then my father came in to find out what was happening with his little girl. I was 8 years old at the time, and I was being held down by the women, neighbors. I am now living in a community where we have neighbors. I hope I never have to do that to another neighbor's child.
Okay.
But in any case, Dr. Smith worked quickly and cleaned out infectious material on my cheek and also in the calf of my leg. And I survived because I'm here to tell the story. So,
Who else was in your family, Mom? You mentioned yourself and you mentioned Murray. Who were the other siblings? Starting with Ethel, who were your other siblings?
Oh, my older sister Jessie was, this was very sad. She was 2 years my senior, and she was in 7th grade at the time. I guess I must have been 5th grade something. And she used to like to hang around me, and if I had a problem in school, if I had to write a composition or an essay, she was there to help. Well, my poor sister Jessie developed scarlet fever, and she was critically ill. Our home was immunized.
It was quarantined. You were quarantined, right?
Department of Health came.
Did they put you in quarantine?
Pardon?
Quarantine? Didn't they quarantine you? Were you put in quarantine?
Yes, they did. They quarantined our apartment. We lived in a tenement house, and what they had to do at the time was close up, and my sister Jessie couldn't go to school because they wouldn't allow it until she recovered sufficiently from scarlet fever. And we children couldn't be at home. So we went to stay we had a Tante Sonia. Tante Sonia was the wife of my mother's brother, who had been in the army at the time during the World War. And when he came home from service, he was in Europe with the army. He was then imposed on, he just had to be put into the service in New York City. And New York City at the time had many Jewish families who had come from overseas. They were all immigrant people, not well educated, but devoted to family. So at that point, when Jessie got scarlet fever, she was 2 years my senior, and she was at that point in the 7th grade in a junior high school. And she was very bright, and they put her into a rapid advanced class. So what could we do? We couldn't just shunt her anyplace. She had to be at home.
Right, but she recovered.
And she had the scarlet fever. Our apartment was quarantined, and she recovered.
Tell us a little bit about your apartment, because that would be interesting for all your great-grandchildren, to hear what your apartment was like. Did you all have your own rooms, all 7 of you?
Oh, my goodness, nobody had their own room. My parents had one bed, and on one wall there was an old fireplace that was never used as a fireplace. It was just something that, it looked like it had been scooped out, and there was above the fireplace was a, what do we call that?
Mantle?
It looked like a shelf of marble.
A mantle.
and we had an ice box. In those days, you didn't have a refrigerator. You had an ice box where a man delivered ice on his shoulder on a heavy, looked like a tarpaulin. He used to have this on his shoulder, on which he had a heavy, big square of ice. And the ice began to melt because he was hot, and the drippings from the ice were dripping all over the floor in this particular room. Anyhow, Jessie finally recovered from scarlet fever, and I, with my leg, also recovered from the wounds that were inflicted by Dr. Smith when he was cleaning out.
Right, but what about, tell us a little bit about what your apartment looked like, and where you slept. What kind of bed did you sleep on? Because these are all very interesting stories.
My parents were the ones who had a bed. The children didn't have beds.
So what did you sleep on?
I slept on a trunk that they came with from Russia. In the trunk, when they came along on Ellis Island, within that trunk, if you lifted up the lid, you found what they called a perina. That was an old quilt that used to be used either as a floor covering so you could sleep on it, or they would throw it across the trunk so we could sleep on it. My sister Ruthie, who was 2 years my junior, slept on one. Sometimes we exchanged places. Sometimes I slept on the trunk, and while I was on the trunk asleep, she would sleep on the ice box. See, in those days, as I said, we didn't have a refrigerator. You had an ice box, and the ice box was a rectangular, low-built thing. And when the Iceman came, he opened up the door and put a great big square of ice into that ice box so that we could have food that would be saved, because we weren't about to just destroy food.
And sometimes you slept on the ice box? Okay, because the tape is running out, this part of the tape. So we're going to end with this part.
When there were drippings from the ice that melted, there underneath the ice box, on the outside, you had to put a flat pail.
Right, but you slept on top of it? You slept on the ice box itself, on the outside?
What?
You slept on the ice box?
I slept on the ice box one night, and Ruthie slept, my younger sister, slept on the trunk. When I slept on the ice box, she slept on the trunk. Then we exchanged places.
Okay.
I would sleep on the trunk, and she slept on the ice box.
Okay, the tape is running out now, so we're going to stop for now, and then we will continue later, okay?
Very well. Thank you very much.
Excellent.